Welcome to Change Shapers, the podcast where we know that the only certainty is uncertainty. We know everybody hates change, so we're on a mission to inspire people to see change differently. Our guest lineup of thought leaders, innovators and transformation pioneers will guide us through uncertainty and discover new opportunities which arise in these interesting times. Today we're joined by Al Preble, a true American leader whose mission is to transform how we see leadership and culture across our society. The structures we're accustomed to are changing, so we need to rethink how organisations and people are run in the future. With his broad academic and industry background, Al explores the myriad obstacles facing organisations and why and how we can foster cross-functional leaders to sail the choppy waters ahead. This episode we're joined by Al Preble. Al has forged an impressive career across diverse sectors, including roles at Suncorp-Metway, Accenture, IBM, and academic positions at Harvard Business School and Columbia University. He's now leading the conversation on leadership as founder and CEO of Cambridge Leadership Group. With over 20 years' experience, they foster purpose-driven leadership and culture, emphasizing the importance of embracing change and uncertainty in today's world. Al, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's an illustrious career there, and can you kind of give our listeners a little bit of an insight into who you are, what you do, and how you got started in all this?
Yeah, it's funny when I listen to you play it back. It sounds a lot more impressive than I feel. I really kind of just fell in love with this idea of people being able to make a bigger difference. I was a kid from San Clemente. At the time, it was a little town, and I wanted to do something with my life. I was born with a cleft palate. And so I had this horrible speech impediment and, of course, ridiculed as a kid and all of that. And I ended up losing my voice outright. And so you start to realize when you have no voice, how scary the world is. And then when you do open your mouth, to get ridicule as a kid, it becomes really scary. And then during adolescence, as your skull grows and all this good stuff, the impediment kind of went away after a lot of speech therapy. But what always stuck with me is, wow, we have got to have a voice in this world and be able to make a difference. And so when I discovered leadership, it was just like, what a great way for people to kind of become more empowered. And I don't mean just striving to be the CEO at the top of an organization, but leadership as a function any of us can exercise, have a bigger voice in the world and make a difference. And that's really the impetus for, I think, what turned me on and keeps me turned on around leadership.
Amazing. And Cambridge Leadership Group, you focus on, as I say, changing this uncertain world. What is it that how do you approach businesses in terms of changing their leadership? Or do they approach you?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I think there's an increasing realization that these ideas around traditional leadership that have served us pretty well are also kind of running out of gas. I mean, traditional leadership, you're the leader, you have the answers, you know what to do, and I'm the follower. And all we need to do is just kind of line up behind our leaders, execute, and it'll all work out. Well, given the complexity of challenges and our organizational structures, which are largely networked, and often formally matrixed, all of a sudden we're working in cross-functional teams, we're influencing customers, we're influencing up the chain across. And so if I don't have a traditional position of power and authority, what do? And we start to kind of run out of gas. And I think people have realized in organizations that leadership has got to be something that we're good at, not just a position.
Nice. Oh, I like that. And you mentioned there about, things are kind of changing. To you, what does leadership look like in 2024? And are we seeing any major shifts and factors that are driving these shifts?
I think sadly leadership persists in being largely control oriented. Now, we've gotten more
Right.
sophisticated through all of our, EQ training, and I'm more
Hmm.
polite about it. But in the end, the ability to shift from kind of a leader follower paradigm to one where, wow, I provide as an authority figure some protection, direction, order. I have decision making responsibility, but I've really got to bring people in and we work together as partners. I don't think we're there yet. And I'll tell you the thing I look at, and it's not surprising, but it's disturbing, with the pandemic, and people got used to working at home. Now, we've long known that people don't leave companies, they leave their managers and leaders. And the
Yeah.
leaders now are coming back and saying, get in the office. And people have just said no. I mean, many of these big companies have flat out said, if you don't come to the office, no more promotions, no more goodies, no more, all the stuff that we strive for. And people have said, fine. About half of people have said, you know what? No problem. I'll just sit it out. And I got to believe that given what a kind of a social creature we are, that if we were
Mm.
coming to the office and we were valued and part of this vibrant exchange of ideas and making a contribution and executing together, you'd see an appetite to come back versus a reluctance. And I think this leader follower paradigm, which is dressed up in polite control, has really reached its end. And we see it in the resistance of people wanting to come back, work together, and work with leaders.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned there, like, the statistics behind flexible working, and these statistics that we've seen a lot of. How do you, and Cambridge Leadership Group, how do you kind of use data to support what it is you're telling? And I imagine there's sometimes some truths, some hard truths that people don't want to hear. How do you use data to kind of support that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of hard truths that on the one hand we don't want to hear them, but on the other hand we kind of do. And hearing hard truths without a pathway forward, I think can be a little bit discouraging. Um,
Mm.
the data set that we use to help people understand what's really going on with their own leadership and their impact on others are the case studies. And you filled one out
Right.
yourself. And we have
Yeah.
about 30,000 of these. And we'll chat about yours here in a second. But,
Mm.
what we ask people to do when they come to the programs is to just document a challenge that they took on, and it just didn't go as well as they'd hoped.
Yeah.
One of the things that we really embrace is people are good at a lot of things. We don't need help there. We need help where we're struggling. And so we ask,
Mm.
just give us a little insight into the challenge. And then we want to see how leaders handle these challenging situations. And the page, as you know, it's a form and it's split into two columns. On the right hand
Hmm.
column, as you know, is how you handled it. And in the
Yeah.
left hand column, it's what you thought and felt and didn't say. And I will tell you, when you look at, and I haven't looked at all 30,000 of them, I'd probably be in a mental institution had I done that.
Yeah.
But when you start to look at thousands and thousands of these left hand columns, you realize just how much untapped potential there is for people to exercise more leadership, and how many of the real issues that could create breakthroughs for organizations get stuck and end up being avoided.
Yeah. And I was really shocked at how simple it was. When you said, and Al invited me to fill out Cambridge Leadership Group's left-hand column form. It's really simple. As you say, it's what's the challenge? What did you do? And what do you think you should have done? And it's really interesting that when you actually sit and ponder and go, oh, what did I want to say there? I think, maybe not just in business, but it kind of works across all of our life, doesn't it?
It sure does. I mean, and you're not the only person, believe me, who said, wow, I do this same thing at home.
Mm.
And at home, it's a little funny because it's almost like we have even a greater expectation that we're going to be heard. But
Yeah.
so often we're not heard because we don't really put it out there. And you tell me if this has happened to you, both my hands are up. So it has happened to me many times. I tend to avoid it because I know there's going to be some discomfort. And then when I'm good and bloody agitated, that's when I bring it up. And I'm at
It
my
comes up.
worst. And it goes
Yeah.
badly. And then I think, why did I do that?
So then you get that kind of insight into a leader. How do you, aside from saying, well, you should have done the left hand column then, how do you kind of guide them into being their best, rather than waiting until they're at their worst? How do you, what's the next step on that?
Yeah, I think advice is one of these things where it's really easy to just dish out advice.
Mm.
The kind of advice we're interested in is actionable advice. And I could just tell
Yeah.
you, I could send everybody an email in the whole world, just blurt out your left hand column and it'll all work out. And
Mm.
it doesn't work out. I think there are things that as human beings, developmentally, and part of my doctor work at Columbia was really cool. It was in leadership and adult development because we know that there are all these great ideas out there, but if we are
Mm.
not developmentally able to embrace and act on those ideas, the ideas just sit there. And I think this
Yeah.
explains in part the knowing doing gap. We know more about leadership than we ever have, and we don't see a sweeping transformation. There's a great quote from Chris Argyris at Harvard Business School before he passed away. We haven't seen a sweeping transformation in leadership in the workforce. And so, we
Mm.
recognize that we know a lot, but we don't often recognize, well, why don't I step up and have a bigger voice? What is it that gets in
Mm.
my way? And one of the people I was lucky enough to kind of hang around with and learn from, a guy named Bob Keegan at the Ed School. And he's probably one of the great, adult developmental thinkers. But, we have competing commitments. So on the one hand, I have the business issue and I kind of I'm thinking it in my left hand column. Boy, if we stall on this any longer, and this is your case study, it's going to become problematic. And the
Yeah.
longer we wait, the more problematic it becomes. And so the
Hmm.
waiting increases the risk. And I'll ask you to respond to this. But there's a competing commitment within us where, gosh, I see the business risk, but I have a relationship risk. And if
Mm.
I kind of blurt this out in a way that it goes south and I hurt the relationship, if I create conflict, God forbid I make it worse, well, now I have a relationship problem and a business problem. I'll just pause there. I see you nodding your head. Does that feel familiar to you?
Yeah, I think it's really relatable, isn't it? Because we want to think that whatever we're working on or whatever our business goal is, as much as they might be aligned, we're all still selfish. I think there is that selfish aspect of me and my team are the focus and not the other person's. And so, as I think you mentioned it perfectly earlier. Of it's almost, it waits to the point where your worst self comes out because there's no other option, because the deadline's here, hard deadline, soft deadline, whatever it is, and then there's no way out. You're at that point of you have to have conflict. And I suppose what I'm interested in there is taking away from just the leadership is the impact on the wider network. So the internal teams, the stakeholder ecosystem, how these leadership decisions can really impact negatively on stakeholders across your ecosystem of a business.
Well, you're really onto it because when we avoid dealing with the business issues, and I've asked thousands of people, do they tend to just improve on their own? And you're already smiling. Almost everybody says they just get worse. And so as we
Yeah.
get closer and closer to the deadline, it increasingly pressurizes things. And now everybody's pressurized. And so these misalignments and the reluctance or just inability to get the real issues on the table are now happening in the context of pressure from deadlines. And so
Yeah.
what we'll often do is just avoid it completely and defer back to authority. It's not my job. I'm not the leader. Somebody else needs to fix this. And of course, when you talk to people kind of up the leadership chain, if you will, and you
Mm.
tell them, hey, people are waiting for you to fix it, you know what they say? But we brought them in to do the fixing. But because we
Yeah.
don't quite know how to do it, we want to avoid conflict. The pressure goes up. We defer then to the leader to fix it instead of us. And so part of the problem
Mm.
there is we don't develop the skill set to get things on the table early and abundantly
Mm.
in an open and honest context so that we can deal with them. And this really comes back to choices we make to avoid things rather than engage them.
Yeah. And I suppose that got me thinking onto the word honesty. And, a lot of this comes down to what we talked about with the left hand and right hand column of what you did say, what you didn't say. How can businesses, whether that's leaders or any individuals within that business that are going to have an impact on the business goals, how can we create a culture of honesty? And there's a lot of talk about culture these days, isn't there? How what are the steps to kind of working towards, maybe not achieving, but working towards that kind of honesty and authenticity?
Yeah, I love what you said there, working towards it. I think, the first place to start, I think, is with the idea of leadership.
Mm.
And what so often happens, and we see it in the case studies, the leader, right, in that position of formal authority, tries to figure out how to get people to do things. And then when they don't kind of do it, they switch into telling them what to do. And a lot of that can be, leading questions, suggestions.
Mm.
But we know when a leader suggests you do something, it's not optional. It's a polite form of command and control. And so what happens there is we condition people to being told what to do and when to do it and how to do it, and we hold them accountable. And so we create this kind of dependency between
Mm.
leaders and people. And then what do the leaders say? Gosh, I want more leadership from my people. I want more innovation. I want more initiative. And so I think one of the breakthroughs for leaders, I was working recently with a guy, a really neat guy, he's a CEO. And he said, it never occurred to me the degree to which people default to what I say. I see it, but I never realized the cost. And one of the big breakthroughs for him was this idea that, not only did he have a left hand column, he was playing it safe with the senior team. He started to
Mm.
realize everybody else was too. And I
Yeah.
worked with a really neat guy down in China. It's a Fortune 500 company, and they got obviously a big presence there. And one of the big breakthroughs for him in the program, and he came back and said, I realize now that when you said a lot of the work is to create conditions to have these conversations where I really get people's left hand columns. And part of the work of leadership is not just to create the conditions, but to work hard and dig in. And then to really publicly acknowledge people and thank them for
Mm.
challenging you, for seeing it differently. And so I asked him, well, what
Yeah.
happened? So you got everybody's left hand column. So what? Is it just a bunch of drama? Like, oh no. And I hear this over and over. The biggest thing I learned is how much I didn't know. And the interdependencies with people, I certainly recognized, but those interdependencies aren't valuable if I'm not really getting their thinking. And once I got their thinking, the way that we thought about problems and opportunities opened up, and we made better decisions, and people were bought into it because they felt they were doing the right thing. I was working with a CEO, another Fortune 50 company, and we're having the conversation about traditional leadership. And he was a really neat guy, and he laughed, and he just said, "Look, let's face it, you only do about half of what I ask you to do." And this is a senior team in a Fortune 50 company, and everybody laughed. And I said, I know it's kind of funny, but why don't you do it? And what do you think the number one reason was that they didn't do what he asked them to do?
Just not being engaged in it, or not being part of the vision. Would that be?
That was a part of it. You're kind of getting there, but they didn't think it was going to work, and they thought it would hurt the business. So instead of then executing on things they thought would hurt the business, they did enough to keep him happy, of course, and then toddle along doing what they needed to do, and it worked pretty well. But you start to see the roots of misalignment. And, there was a new strategy and vision, and they had fallen short on some of these things. And I asked the group, how many of you had concerns about your ability to execute and realize this thing in your left-hand columns? And you kind of see all the hands go up. How long have you been concerned? From the beginning. And I asked the CEO, did you enjoy going to the board knowing that she had fallen short? He said, no, I did not enjoy it. And then he said something so great. If I'd known, we could have done something different, reprioritized, reallocated resources, maybe had new ideas. And so what he said, this is our first session together, he said, what I'm going to be doing is asking for your left-hand columns and telling you mine. And so creating what we call a left-hand column culture. I had a great client in Europe, and she had T-shirts printed that said, dude, what's in your left-hand column? And once the cat's out of the bag, it really makes it nice. I just say, hey, what's in your left-hand column? I really want to know. And it's like you acknowledge that there's something important there, but you also let people know you want to hear it. And that's a breakthrough.
Yeah. It's so aligned with this approach, engaging all the stakeholders.
Yeah.
And we when we talk about that, we don't just mean your team, your business. It's the wider ecosystem. It's your clients, your customer. If you're in a supply chain, it's suppliers. And I think it's really getting to people to understand that of, if you do that from an early point, not only will you see that actually everyone's buying in, like you said with that example, what more could we do? Yeah. And everyone's trying to get more, whether it's more profit, whether it's more clients, whether it's whatever it is. Yeah. And I think that's so interesting that hits right in that sweet spot of.
Yeah. And that term, engaging stakeholders. I think we need to put frankly, some more rigorous criteria about what that means. I mean, I can fill out a stakeholder map and come and engage you and talk with you, but the relationship with stakeholders has got to revolve around, we engage to work together to deal with the real issues and have these open and honest left-hand column discussions with respect. I mean, because I respect you, I share what I think. And that's a different way of thinking about engagement, because conversations that aren't about engaging the real stuff, the heart of the matter, no wonder we're frustrated with a lot of these meetings.
Yeah. Do you see working with the larger type of organizations? We've had a few guests on our podcast who they're more focused on SMEs and charities, things like that. Working with the large organizations, do you see that those types of Fortune 500, Fortune 50, these massive companies, do you think they can do that? Do you think across their stakeholder, as wide as they are, really bring about engagement across their ecosystem?
You know, I think in theory, sure,
Mm.
but I think there's going to have to be some real learning and change around how
Yeah.
we handle this stuff. And one of the problems, I think, with this stuff, I would love to tell you I came up with all this stuff and I'm just so smart. I am not. Um, if you go back, would have been 1974, Theory and Practice. Chris Argyris wrote it. Um, and all the stuff on the left-hand column is in there. And so the
Right.
genesis of this goes back to 74, even earlier, of course, with Chris. I was lucky enough to be trained by him. But we've known about this stuff for a long, long time. And
Yeah.
I think we recognize the holy grail is real behavior change. And yet, so much of what we choose to do with leaders still is superficial. And you've got the latest flavor of the month and the latest fad, and people get sucked into all kinds of things they hope are going to create a deep change. But that change has been quite elusive.
Yeah. I'm a parent of a 3-year-old, so I know all about things moving on, but also lots of trends and
Yeah,
new ideas that maybe are definitely flavour of the
yeah,
month. So,
absolutely.
and I think the other aspect I really wanted to kind of drill down on you with is for companies at the moment, whether it's flexibility, culture, sustainability, diversity, there's no end to challenges that, especially in the culture, that they need to focus on. How can organisations know deep down that they're not just focusing on the flavour of the month, that they're actually tackling the most impactful challenges and focusing on real issues? I know you've spoken about real issues in the past.
Well, I think this is this is sort of one of the. It's kind of heartbreaking. I think people already know. When you talk to people about meetings, people
Mm.
are so over meetings. Um, and well, why? Well, because what is the biggest frustration in a meeting? We're not dealing with the real stuff that makes a difference. And so I come to the meeting and I watch people, they talk, the other person
Mm.
talks, they change the subject, power plays, dynamics, all of this
Mm.
stuff. And we don't feel like we're getting to the heart of the matter. And when we're not getting to the heart of the matter, I don't feel like my contribution is making an impact in moving us forward. And so we often leave the meeting and then go talk to like minded people.
Yeah.
And then we feel a little stuck. So we recognize intellectually that the real stuff is there to be dealt with, but it
Mm.
seems elusive. And we don't quite know what to do about it. And we keep hoping somebody somewhere along the way will figure it out. So this stuff becomes quite different. And when we engage with each other, it is around the real stuff because human beings, we're natural problem solvers and we
Mm.
like to figure things out and make things better. And when we're doing that, our engagement goes up. And when we're frustrated around that, our engagement goes down. And so I think people kind of know it and feel it, but we don't really know what to do about it. And yet there are some answers out there.
Yeah. And talking about answers and ideas, I think you're a really interesting example of someone with experience both in academia and business. And you've obviously worked with cross-sector leaders and academics in
Mm-hmm.
your experience. How important is that kind of wide-ranging community of ideas if we're going to overcome these challenges, as you just said, that we all know are there? What is it about those kind of not just thinking in silos, as it were?
Yeah. Well, look at uh, if nobody got out of bed for a
Mm.
month, all of our human problems would just sort of go away. So human beings on this path to progress, we create a set
Mm.
of problematic realities. And the promise of our humanity is the ability to come together and deal with that stuff. Good friend of mine, Dean Williams, he was my professor and one of my surf buddies. He had this, he heads up the global change program at Harvard. Um, and he has a great working definition of leadership, bringing groups together to confront and deal with problematic realities to improve the human condition. Now, if we bring people together to face things, the pathway forward is going to depend on new ideas, better ways of thinking, solving problems, new opportunities. So ideas become so critical. And these communities of ideas that are really expressed, that can be acted on, are just critical. And if people are playing it safe and they want harmony rather than some of that tension that comes from ideas, and it's the differences in our ideas that create the breakthroughs, but it's the differences that create conflict. And so we have a reticence there to hold back and avoid conflict. But with that comes the dissipation of the ideas we need to really solve problems and create breakthroughs in businesses and for our world.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me on to, you were talking there about, ideas and the readiness for that. I think a lot of if we look at AI at the moment, unprecedented change in such a short space of time. What's your advice to companies who, we've got all these things ahead of us, that there's a need to be adaptable and resilient, like you just mentioned there, for that friction. You just mentioned that friction there. Yeah. What's your advice about adaptability and
Adaptability has been around, this idea for a long time. Ronnie Heifetz at the Kennedy School at Harvard, he really pioneered a lot of the ideas I'm talking about. He taught there starting in the 80s. Dean also taught there. I was lucky enough to kind of hang around them. But Ronnie was kind of the first guy to really untether and differentiate between authority as a position and leadership that could be exercised. And so, in the U.S., for example, one of the greatest, people in our history, Martin Luther King, no formal authority. He wasn't an authority figure, but he exercised leadership and compelled the country to take a hard look at the mismatch between our values and our behaviors. And that became the genesis of us adapting in a way that moved us forward. And Ronnie calls it adaptive leadership sometimes. But you start to think about adaptability if we are in that leader-follower paradigm where the leader has the answers. I think adaptability really suffers. You've got to make leadership accessible to everybody. People are providing leadership when and where it's needed. And that's going to be the genesis of adaptability, because without that, we're going to default to dependency on leaders to have the answers. And I don't think leaders have the answers to the level of complexity we're facing, as a world and in our companies. It's going to take a lot of people exercising a lot of leadership to produce real adaptability and better ideas.
All right. I really like that. It's the community aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah.
I suppose just finishing off there of, you've said that we need that. What is your kind of vision for the next, over the next, let's say, up to 2030? How do you see this paradigm shift changing? And are you hopeful, or are you kind of a bit skeptical? What's your position?
Oh, I, I think it's foolish not to be optimistic. I think it was I don't know, was it Gladwell? The Age of Enlightenment, and he just looked at all of the statistics around our progress in terms of the human family, and we really are doing better. Now, the media, of course, they don't make money talking about how great things are going. They make money on how awful it all is. And I get that. And so there's almost a preoccupation with the negativity. But the truth is, we are creating breakthroughs. I mean, gosh, you look at, my mom. Boy, you know, my dad was a rough guy, and the path for her to go out and make a living for her children outside of him was so limited. And now my daughter, who's 33, pops off to grad school, makes a couple $100,000 a year. She's a full-on leader. She's amazing. These are breakthroughs. And we got a lot of work to do. So there's so much to be hopeful about and appreciative without ignoring the challenges. And I think one of the things I'm most hopeful about is around this. I don't know. I'm not a technologist at my core, but I think AI will be revolutionary in terms of our ability to deliver better things to people. The limitation to it is going to be if we just put the same old ideas into the new technology. When I was at IBM, they called it junk in, junk out. But the promise, particularly around the ideas I'm talking about, getting this stuff dispersed and creating opportunities for people to learn how to do it almost in a simulated environment through AI, so people can really learn leadership and practice it before they execute, could be a breakthrough. And the last thing I'll say is, I think the relationship between competence and courage, I don't think we talk about that enough. It'd be kind of like me saying, hey, just blurt your left-hand column out. Well, that's all about courage, right? And then you're going to get smacked down. But when we get good at things, things get a whole lot less scary. When we get good at things, our optimism goes up. And so developing competence and fusing it with courage as a pathway forward, I think there's tremendous promise there. And I think technology is going to hold a very promising role. And I hope I get to come back and talk with you in 3 or 4 months, because we're very close to something and I'd love to share it with you. But I do think there's tremendous promise, and we got to be careful of the downside. Ethical AI is going to be critical, and we can't just let it get away from us.
It's really powerful. And I think also, if anyone's needing to be inspired, someone who went from not being able to speak to speaking as eloquently as you have today, I think it's definitely an inspiration now. I really enjoyed that conversation. And for those listening, where can people find Cambridge Leadership, and how can they kind of go about approaching you in terms of finding out about their leadership?
Yeah, we have the old website, cambridgeleadership.com, and I'm pretty accessible. And look, I love this stuff. And like I told you, I would love to say, I just thought of it all because I'm just so brilliant. Where I was fortunate, I worked with a lot of extraordinary people to put what I think was the best of everything together in something. Because, one of the things that I struggled with as just a kid, a little surf guy from San Clemente, all my buddies are still down there surfing, and I'm sitting around in, Columbia and Harvard and these Fortune 500 companies. And I thought, these are the folks who have the most going for them, and they still need this stuff. What about everybody else? And that's really been kind of my purpose. How do we get these great ideas in the hands of everybody? And you can go to the site, and we've got a lot of things coming that are going to make this stuff much, much more available to everybody.
The links will be in the show notes. And Al, thank you so much again for your time.
No, listen, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Well, there you have it. Powerful insights into the world of business and what lies ahead. Thank you to all our Change Shapers listeners for tuning into our podcast, and to our guest today for sharing their knowledge with our community. Our episodes are designed to spark conversation and start collaborations. So if you're interested by what you heard, then please share with your colleagues or on social media and join the chat with our guest today. Change Shapers is part of the Casaris brand, and we can be found on LinkedIn. Just search for COSARIS, or on Instagram as Change Shapers Podcast. Please subscribe, rate and review Change Shapers Podcast. We can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favourite pods. I've been Jay Taylor. Let's turn uncertainty into opportunity together. Catch you in the next episode.